Imagine a country where um, the fundamental mathematics of human existence have just completely inverted. Like, the death rate doesn't just occasionally tick above the birth rate, it permanently eclipses it.
Right, a complete inversion.
Exactly. And the population isn't just getting older. I mean, it's rapidly aging into this inverted demographic pyramid.
Hmm.
And then you take that society with its shrinking, aging workforce, and you subject its economy to multiple, devastating, double-digit GDP contractions, all within a single decade.
Yeah, and by every established macroeconomic textbook, the scenario you're setting up for us, it ends in systemic collapse.
Total collapse, right?
Absolutely. A society facing that specific cocktail of demographic implosion and extreme economic volatility, it should enter a death spiral. You'd expect capital flight, hyperinflation, complete deindustrialization, and, well, an eventual breakdown of basic state functions.
Because the traditional models tell us that an economy simply cannot sustain those kinds of compound fractures.
They can't, but the data tells a completely different story.
And that right there is the mind-bending riddle we are unpacking for you today on this deep dive. Because instead of collapsing into a failed state, the World Bank indicators for this exact country show higher education rates absolutely skyrocketing.
It's wild. We are talking about a society where a booming, hyper-modern service sector rapidly and, frankly, organically replaced traditional heavy industry, almost like a biological survival mechanism.
Yeah, so today we are analyzing the atypical, stubborn structural resilience of Ukraine. And just a quick note for you listening, we're pulling from a massive stack of World Bank data indicators, and we're completely impartial here. We're just looking at the numbers and the source material provided.
Right. Our mission is to pierce through the surface-level chaos of this macro data to understand the underlying mechanics. Like, how does a society actually survive when the ground gives way beneath it?
So how are we breaking this down?
Well, we're going to look at it across 4 interconnected pillars that we found in the data. First, the foundational demographic crisis. Second, the macroeconomic earthquakes. Third, the hidden engine of human capital. And finally, the institutional bottlenecks that keep this engine from fully unleashing its power.
Okay, so we have to start at the absolute bottom layer of the foundation. I mean, before we can even talk about factories or IT sectors or GDP growth, we have to talk about human beings.
The sheer number of people available to actually turn the gears of an economy?
Exactly. And the data here outlines something demographers refer to as a death cross.
Yeah, the death cross. And the mechanics of this dictate the boundaries of literally everything else we will discuss today. If you map out the crude birth rate against the crude death rate over the last few decades, you see a really chilling trajectory.
The numbers in the report are stark.
They really are. Historically, the crude birth rate hovered around like 15 to 20 per thousand people. But then it begins this relentless structural slide downward, eventually plummeting below 10 per thousand.
Wait, under 10.
Under 10. While simultaneously, the death rate doesn't just spike temporarily because of a single event, It climbs and locks in at a high, stubborn plateau of around 14 to 16 per thousand.
So it crosses over the birth rate and just stays there.
It stays there. You are left with a permanent yawning deficit. It's not a temporary fluctuation in the labor pool. It is a fundamental evaporation of the human base.
Wow. And the nature of that evaporation, it completely alters the economic reality for the people who remain.
Right. It does, because the overarching issue isn't simply that there are fewer people, it's the severe distortion of the age distribution. The World Bank data highlights the old age dependency ratio.
Right, which is the proportion of people over the age of 65 compared to the core working age population, so 15 to 64-year-olds.
Exactly. And that specific metric is what completely changes the gravity of the situation. The data shows this ratio surging from around 11% to over 28%.
Over 28%. That is a massive jump.
It's huge. Think about the immense silent pressure that puts on the working age population. I mean, even though the working age bracket maintained around 68 to 70% of the total population for a while, they are being violently squeezed from both ends of the demographic spectrum.
How so?
Well, on one side, they are forming families later and having far fewer children, meaning the pipeline of future workers is drying up. And on the other side, they are suddenly tasked with supporting a rapidly expanding elderly population.
To put that in mechanical terms for you listening, imagine trying to keep a massive factory running at full capacity. But every single year, fewer and fewer workers clock in for their shift.
Right.
And the ones who do show up aren't just doing their own jobs, they're carrying increasingly heavy backpacks filled with the societal obligations of pension support, healthcare costs, general social safety nets.
That's a great analogy.
They have to generate enough economic velocity to move themselves forward, plus drag the growing weight of the retired population behind them.
And that is the precise macroeconomic dilemma. When your dependency ratio effectively doubles, an enormous percentage of your national income, whether through direct taxation or state borrowing, it has to be diverted away from productive investment.
So it can't go into building new infrastructure?
Exactly. It can't fund cutting-edge research or capitalize new startups. It goes toward basic societal maintenance. You are sailing a ship into a constant compounding headwind. This labor supply constraint is the baseline reality.
Okay, so that is the baseline. You have a shrinking, rapidly aging workforce,
Yeah.
a foundation of sand. Now, what happens when you take a society already struggling to carry that demographic weight and you drop a series of massive global and geopolitical anvils squarely on top of it?
Well, the structural integrity fails. And that is exactly what the macroeconomic data reveals when we look at the second pillar. When we analyze the per capita GDP figures, the defining characteristic isn't just slow growth. It is extreme, violent volatility.
Yeah, the violence of these swings is hard to overstate. We have the data on per capita GDP in constant 2015 US dollars, and there are these terrifying cliff edge drops.
The chart literally looks like a roller coaster.
It does. In 2009, driven by the global financial crisis, GDP growth crashed by roughly 15%.
A massive hit.
And then, the economy barely had time to catch its breath before hitting 2014 and 2015. Driven by massive geopolitical conflict, the economy suffers consecutive, devastating contractions. We're talking negative growth rates of 6.6% and then almost 10%.
We really need to contextualize what a 15% drop in GDP actually means on the ground, because for people accustomed to stable Western economies, it's hard to conceptualize.
Right, like what does that actually look like?
Well, in a developed economy, a 2 or 3% contraction is a severe recession. It dominates the news cycle, it bankrupts corporations. But a 15% drop, followed a few years later by another cumulative double-digit drop, I mean, that is a structural earthquake.
It doesn't just pause economic activity.
No, it annihilates capital formation. It destroys deeply integrated supply chains, and it completely resets the baseline of national wealth.
And that is the exact friction point that makes this data so baffling to me. Because if we look at this through the lens of a private enterprise, like if a massive corporation took a 15% hit to its revenue overnight and then another 10% hit a few years later while simultaneously losing its workforce, it wouldn't restructure.
Right, it would be liquidated.
It would cease to exist. So how does a national economy absorb these concussive existential blows without disintegrating into absolute chaos?
The answer requires us to stop looking at the economy as a rigid structure and start looking at it as a complex, adaptive ecosystem. Extreme volatility forces rapid Darwinian evolution.
Okay, explain that.
The traditional economic models that defined much of Ukraine's historical output simply couldn't survive this level of continuous shock. Historically, this was an economy deeply reliant on heavy, capital-intensive industry. Massive steel plants, heavy machinery manufacturing, chemical processing.
Those are industries that require absolute environmental predictability, right?
Precisely. A blast furnace cannot operate on a volatile schedule. Heavy manufacturing requires highly predictable energy costs, stable supply chains for raw materials, and massive amounts of upfront capital.
Right.
When the macroeconomic ground is shaking violently, when ports are compromised or foreign capital flees, those rigid structures crack. The economy couldn't just wait out the storm. It had to mutate in order to continue generating value.
It's the ultimate adapt or die scenario. The rigid structures snap, but the flexible structures bend and survive.
Yeah.
And that mutation becomes incredibly obvious when we pivot to the third pillar and look at where the human beings actually went.
Where the labor flowed, exactly.
Because that brings us to the most significant structural reallocation in the data set. The silent pivot from smokestacks to services. The employment and value-added GDP shifts really solve the riddle of the country's survival.
They do. We see a massive, undeniable hollowing out of the traditional industrial base. The numbers are stark.
Yeah, let's look at the numbers. Agricultural employment, which historically was a major driver, withered down to around 14% of the workforce.
And industrial employment, which was the backbone of their economic model, contracted from well over 32% down to around 24 or 25%.
The heavy industrial base was quite literally shaken apart by the macroeconomic earthquakes we just discussed. The industrial value added as a percentage of GDP just plummeted from over 45% down to around 22%.
But, an economy abhors a vacuum. While the industrial sector bled out, the service sector absorbed the shock. Employment in services steadily and aggressively climbed, eventually capturing over 60% of the total workforce.
Over 60%.
Yeah, it organically transitioned into the undisputed dominant engine for value-added GDP.
And we need to be very specific about what services means here, because we aren't just talking about domestic retail or coffee shops or hospitality. I mean, you can't sustain a national economy facing double-digit contractions just by selling each other lattes.
No, absolutely not. We are talking about high-value, exportable cognitive labor. Information technology, software engineering, complex financial modeling, specialized business consulting.
If we go back to our earlier mechanical analogy, it really is an evolutionary adaptation. Heavy industry is like a massive lumbering dinosaur. It is incredibly powerful, but its sheer size makes it hyper-vulnerable to rapid environmental changes.
Right.
When the economic meteors hit in 2009 and 2014, the dinosaur couldn't pivot, it starved. But the economy evolved into a nimble, agile mammal. The service sector is the mammal.
That's exactly it. You cannot pack up a steel mill and move it when a crisis hits. But a senior software developer can put a laptop in a backpack, take a train 500 miles west, open the laptop, and resume generating export value within an hour.
The decoupling of labor from physical geography is the key survival mechanism here.
And it wasn't a proactive government master plan. It was a raw, decentralized survival instinct. The service sector, particularly IT, requires significantly less physical infrastructure. It is structurally insulated from domestic supply chain breakdowns.
If a major port closes, a heavy machinery factory is paralyzed.
Right, but if a port closes, an IT firm just writes code on a satellite internet connection and exports it digitally to clients in London or New York. The friction of the physical macroeconomy simply doesn't apply to them in the same way.
Okay, but there's a massive catch to this theory. You can't just snap your fingers and wish a high-value tech and service sector into existence. A knowledge economy requires a very specific type of fuel.
You need brains.
You need advanced cognitive talent. If your workforce only knows how to operate heavy machinery, you can't just hand them laptops and expect them to start coding back-end financial systems.
Which brings us to the hidden engine of this entire survival story, the human capital data. This is perhaps the most remarkable finding in the entire World Bank dataset.
It absolutely blew my mind. Because logically, when a country faces a 15% GDP drop, a demographic collapse, and geopolitical chaos, you expect civil society to degrade.
You expect institutional decay, yeah.
But the data shows that human capital accumulation never stopped. The youth and adult literacy rates remained locked at a near-perfect 100%.
That baseline of literacy is impressive, but the metric that truly defines this economic pivot is the gross tertiary education enrollment.
Right, the percentage of the population moving into higher education, universities, specialized technical institutes.
The growth curve here is just a solid wall of upward momentum. In the middle of an absolute economic roller coaster, the gross enrollment rate surges from around 50% all the way up to over 80%.
Wait, while factories were closing and the currency was violently fluctuating, the population was flooding into the university system. How is that possible? How did the system even absorb that demand?
Well, from a sociological standpoint, it makes perfect rational sense. Think about the incentives facing an average family in that environment. In periods of extreme macro instability, when physical assets lose their value and factories are shut down, what is the safest investment you can make?
Education.
Education becomes the ultimate portable asset. It is an inflation-proof, crisis-proof lifeboat. Society intuitively doubled down on the one thing that couldn't be seized or devalued, which is knowledge.
They decoupled their future from the physical environment. If the local economy collapses, a degree in computer science allows you to plug into the global economy.
Precisely. But, we can't just look at the aggregate numbers because there is a demographic nuance hidden inside this tertiary education data that is completely fascinating.
Oh, the gender divergence.
Yes. When we break down that 80+% enrollment rate, we find a massive gender divergence. We look at the gender parity index, the GPI in education, and in this data set, it heavily, profoundly favors women. The GPI is consistently greater than 1.
The female gross enrollment in tertiary education reached staggering heights over this period. I mean, the data shows female enrollment bursting through the 90% mark, hitting 92% in some recorded years.
92%, that is near universal higher education for women.
And meanwhile, male enrollment metrics, while still very respectable, were vastly outperformed, hovering in the 75 to 79% range.
So we have this massive divergence. And what is the actual on-the-ground economic mechanic of that 92% female enrollment rate? How does that move the needle for the whole country?
It creates a massive structural gender dividend, right?
It does. This highly educated female workforce became a silent, profoundly resilient anchor for the entire economy. Let's connect the dots back to the collapse of heavy industry.
Right, the dinosaurs.
The jobs that were disappearing. The rigid, physically demanding roles in steel, mining, and heavy manufacturing were overwhelmingly male-dominated. The traditional male-dominated physical economy crumbles.
So you have a massive displacement of traditional male labor.
Exactly. But simultaneously, this incredibly vast pool of highly educated, adaptable, primarily female talent was graduating and entering a workforce that was desperately trying to pivot to services.
They were perfectly positioned to step into the rising digital and cognitive sectors.
They were. The macroeconomic shift from physical labor to cognitive labor found a ready-made engine in this specific demographic. The female labor force provided the cognitive bandwidth required to scale the IT and business service sectors while the legacy economy burned.
It's an inspiring story of structural resilience. But we have to look at the whole picture. And as with all complex data sets, there is a severe flip side.
There is.
While the education data shines brilliantly, particularly for women, looking closely at the gender data also forces us to confront a very dark, deeply concerning shadow hanging over the demographics.
We cannot ignore the dual nature of this gender divergence, because while female outcomes in education and the new economy were soaring, the data on male outcomes points to a localized tragedy.
When we examine the mortality indicators, there's an incredibly wide, disturbing gap between adult male and female mortality rates. The male mortality line is completely decoupled from the female line.
It sits vastly higher. And when we trace this back to the cause of death indicators provided by the World Bank, it points to an acute crisis in adult male health.
We aren't just talking about the elderly dying off, right?
No, we are talking about men in their prime working years. The data reflects a lethal confluence of factors primarily tied to non-communicable diseases.
Specifically cardiovascular issues.
Yes, which are heavily accelerated by deeply entrenched lifestyle factors and systemic stress. The health surveys note exceptionally high rates of male smoking and alcohol consumption compared to female rates internally and male rates globally.
It's the physiological toll of the economic shocks we discussed earlier. You have the acute stress of economic collapse, the loss of identity associated with the death of heavy industry, and the historical occupational hazards of those legacy industries.
You combine that immense psychological and physical stress with high rates of tobacco and alcohol use, and you have a perfect storm for premature male mortality.
And this public health tragedy bleeds directly back into the macroeconomic reality. It creates a vicious cycle.
It does. If we connect this back to our very first point, the foundational demographic crisis, this male health crisis acts as a massive accelerant. You already have a shrinking birth rate and an exploding elderly dependency ratio.
Right.
Losing a significant percentage of your prime working age male population exacerbates that labor shortage. It strips the economy of critical labor and tax revenue and makes that highly educated female workforce not just an asset, but an absolute existential necessity.
They are holding up the sky because the male workforce is quite literally dying off at an unsustainable rate. Now, while we are navigating these more sobering statistics, I want to pivot to another paradox in the data. Because sometimes a specific metric looks incredibly positive on paper, but when you unpack the how and the why, the reality is actually quite grim.
You're referring to the environmental indicators.
Yes, the environmental mirage. The data on CO2 and total greenhouse gas emissions show significant, steep, long-term drops. Now, if you are an environmental scientist looking purely at atmospheric data, you look at that and celebrate.
A massive drop in emissions is a win for the climate.
But we are looking at this through an economic lens.
And through an economic lens, the mechanism of that reduction is all that matters. Was this dramatic drop in greenhouse gases driven by proactive investments in green technology? Did the country build massive renewable energy grids and transition to high-efficiency manufacturing?
Knowing what we know about their GDP contractions and capital flight, I'm going to say absolutely not.
You are correct. The data shows that historically, Ukraine operated an economy with massive energy intensity. It was incredibly reliant on heavy fossil fuels to power its legacy industrial base. The energy consumed per unit of GDP was staggeringly high. We're talking fossil fuel consumption making up between 70 and 90% of their total energy use.
So the drastic drop in emissions is not an active policy success.
No, it is a passive byproduct of the exact economic trauma we've been discussing. The heavy industry didn't get greener, it just died. The blast furnaces went cold, therefore they burned less coal and emitted less CO2.
It's like celebrating a patient's rapid weight loss, only to realize the weight loss is because they've been stranded on a desert island without food. They didn't adopt a healthy lifestyle, they just starved.
It is the definition of passive greening, and the danger of passive greening is that it leaves the core structural problem completely unsolved. The underlying physical infrastructure remains highly energy intensive.
So if a massive influx of capital were to restart that heavy industrial base tomorrow, the emissions would violently spike right back up.
Exactly, because the technological baseline hasn't been upgraded. It's a stark warning to not misinterpret a symptom of severe economic contraction as a signal of technological advancement.
Which is a perfect segue to the final piece of our puzzle, the fourth pillar, the Achilles heel. Because as we step back and look at the whole board, we have a fascinating, conflicting picture.
Really do.
On one hand, you have this incredibly resilient, highly educated population, boasting 92% female higher education enrollment. They've successfully pivoted the economy toward agile digital services. They survived massive 15% GDP shocks.
They're clearly capable of advanced cognitive labor.
So my question is this. If the human capital is so phenomenal, why hasn't this translated into the country becoming a massive, wealthy, high-tech export powerhouse on the global stage? Why aren't they building microchips, advanced robotics, and biomedical devices?
To answer that, we have to look at the intersection of trade data and governance data. This is where the structural bottleneck lies. Let's look at global integration first. The data shows Ukraine is highly dependent on trade. Their imports and exports represent a massive percentage of their total GDP.
They are deeply embedded in global markets.
Yes. However, when you look at the specific composition of that trade, there is a glaring disappointment. The high technology exports data. Given the sheer volume of human capital and the incredible tertiary education enrollment, the economic models predict a booming high-tech manufacturing export sector.
But the data shows that high technology exports represent a disappointingly small, entirely stagnant fraction of their manufactured exports. We are looking at numbers shrinking from over $2 billion down to under $1 billion annually.
For a country with this level of educational density, that number should be exponentially higher.
So the brains are there, the education is there, the workforce is capable, but the physical output isn't happening. The human capital is not successfully translating into high-tech manufacturing dominance. Why? What is the missing ingredient?
Capital. Specifically, stable, long-term foreign direct investment, or FDI. To build a state-of-the-art microprocessor plant, or advanced aerospace manufacturing facilities, you need massive amounts of capital.
You need global corporations to come in, build billion-dollar physical facilities on your soil, and integrate your local talent into their global supply chains.
Exactly. You need a global tech giant to look at your country and say, yes, I will sink $5 billion into the ground here. But when we look at the FDI data in this report, it's highly erratic.
It is violently volatile. If you look at the net inflows of foreign direct investment, the capital completely dries up or even reverses into net outflows during the crisis years of 2009 and 2014.
Capital is the ultimate coward. It desperately seeks high returns, but it absolutely demands security. And this is where the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators complete the puzzle.
Right, the WGI.
When you look at the percentiles for metrics like rule of law, control of corruption, and regulatory quality, this data set places the institutional environment in the bottom third globally. We're talking the 20 to 30% range for much of the observed period.
And there is the invisible ceiling.
Yeah.
Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a global CEO or a major institutional investor. You were looking for a place to build your next advanced manufacturing hub. You look at the talent pool in this country. You see the 92% female college enrollment, the engineering degrees, the IT proficiency, and you are salivating.
The labor force is perfect.
But then you look at the regulatory environment. You look at the corruption indices. You factor in the geopolitical risk of your physical factory being destroyed or having your supply chain choked by arbitrary customs disputes.
and you run the math. The friction costs of that institutional fragility and geopolitical risk completely wipe out the benefits of the highly educated labor. You say it's not worth the risk.
It makes it incredibly difficult to attract that sticky, long-term investment required to build heavy, high-tech infrastructure.
Instead, the foreign capital that does flow in tends to be highly opportunistic, seeking quick bargains during brief periods of stability, but rapidly fleeing the borders at the first sign of trouble.
It is the ultimate tragedy of this data set. You look at these numbers, and you realize the workforce is practically begging to be unleashed. The people have done everything right. They adapted, they survived the shocks, they got the degrees.
But the institutional framework acts as a heavy lead ceiling on their ultimate potential.
It is a profound structural mismatch between the quality of the human capital and the quality of the institutions governing them. But crucially, this exact mismatch also perfectly explains why the service sector was the only thing that could succeed.
Oh, because it bypasses the physical friction. Exactly. Let's revisit our IT outsourcing firm. If you are starting a software consultancy, you do not need a billion-dollar factory. You do not need to import physical raw materials through corrupt customs checkpoints. You just need a laptop, human brain power, and an internet connection.
You bypass the institutional bottlenecks entirely.
The digital service sector allows you to export your value directly to the global market without having to physically navigate the broken institutional infrastructure. The massive pivot to services wasn't just an adaptation to macroeconomic shocks, it was a highly rational adaptation to poor governance and high institutional friction.
Wow. It was the path of least resistance for a highly educated population trapped in a high-risk environment.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pull all this together and synthesize this incredible paradox for you listening. We started this deep dive with a picture of absolute demographic and economic doom, a foundational death cross. A rapidly shrinking aging workforce facing an impossible dependency ratio.
And a legacy industrial economy suffering concussive double-digit collapses.
By all rights, the data should have shown a society in total irreversible decline.
But diving deeper into the metrics revealed a society that stubbornly refused to stagnate. The ultimate takeaway from this World Bank data is a necessary redefinition of what resilience actually looks like in the 21st century.
Right.
In this specific case, structural resilience did not come from macroeconomic stability. It certainly didn't come from perfect governance or massive foreign investment. It was built organically from the ground up by the individuals.
Specifically, by a highly educated populace, driven notably by an incredibly mobilized female workforce.
Yes. They passively but effectively forced a transition away from rigid, vulnerable, heavy industry into an adaptable, decentralized, and resilient cognitive service economy.
They out-educated their own economic collapse. It is an amazing story of human adaptation hidden inside dry spreadsheets and line charts. And it leaves me with a lingering, provocative question that I want you to mull over long after we sign off today. We'll look around at the rest of the developed world right now. Look at Western Europe, East Asia, North America. Many of these highly developed nations are currently facing their exact own versions of this baseline crisis. Rapidly aging populations, shrinking birth rates, and looming economic shifts.
The demographic death crosses are appearing in the data for the world's largest economies right now.
Exactly. The foundation is shifting globally. So instead of looking at Ukraine merely as an anomaly like specific countries simply trying to survive a unique, localized crisis, could their accidental survival model actually be the blueprint?
That is a fascinating thought.
Right. If physical capital becomes too risky, too expensive, or too constrained by aging demographics, could this strategy of abandoning legacy physical industries to rely almost entirely on the agile, highly educated human capital of a decentralized digital service sector be the unavoidable future that the rest of the developed world will eventually have to follow?
Are we looking at an outlier or are we looking at a preview?
Yeah, exactly. It's something to think about. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. We'll catch you next time.